Welcome back to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. While press freedom has made some gains in some African countries, it's deteriorating in others. On a continent which continues to struggle with corruption, inadequate governance and political instability, African journalists are critical in holding governments accountable. But are we relying on Western media to tell our own stories? And are African journalists even free to report the truth? Earlier this week, I was joined on Skype from Cape Town in South Africa by Nicholas Pompigne-Monyard. He's the founder and chairman of the leading Pan-African communications consultancy, APO Group. Nicholas, press freedom has historically been a very contentious issue on the African continent. How do you think this has evolved since the time you've been within the industry? And do you think social media is playing a major part?
Well, in fact, if you look at the figures, in 2018, 54 journalists died in the world, out of which 2 journalists died in Africa. So 54 globally, 2 in Africa. Those were the figures for 2018. And those journalists which died in Africa died in Somalia and in Central African Republic. So when we refer to press freedom in Africa, we usually think about the journalists who died, maybe also journalists which are jailed. But when you look at the figures, there is not so many journalists dying in Africa compared to the figures in the world globally. So that's the first thing. Now, the threat to press freedom in Africa has evolved along the years. A few years ago, 10 years ago, yes, indeed, as an African journalist, you were exposed to being killed, being jailed, being threatened. Now, the threat to press freedom, media freedom is much more pernicious. You have to search for this threat in the ownership of the media landscape.
You hear it all the time, Africa must tell their own stories. That's what all the big conglomerates say when they've got their bureaus, whether it's in Addis Ababa or in Kampala. But we should tell our own stories. Are we telling the right stories? Are we telling the accurate stories?
In Nigeria, the higher middle class is starting to spend more time watching the international media than the African media. And it is a trend which I found, I traveled around 10 to 12 probably countries this year, and each time I'm traveling and in a country I'm meeting media owners, and the trend is there across the continent.
Why?
The African population is starting to kind of divorce from the African media and are spending more and more time watching international media. So I guess the question here is why, and the answer may very well be the content. So to your question, are the African media telling the right story, which I will rephrase, producing the right content? Well, I'm not sure, because I'm guessing if there were the African population will, not, divorce from them, and they will not spend more and more time watching the international media.
It's interesting, isn't it? It's a catch-22, because one of my next questions was going to be whether or not Western media still has a dominance on the continent. And I presume you'll be saying yes. I've also heard from a lot of my colleagues and friends on the ground that a lot of Chinese media companies are doing very well in Africa, especially if you can't pay for those DSTV or other subscriptions. If they cut off, you will still get Chinese news.
Well, it is very true that Chinese are investing massively in the African media landscape. I'm in South Africa, in Cape Town right now, and for instance, we know that some Chinese interests have invested in several of the biggest media here in South Africa, but that's also the case for Start Time, for instance, and a few others, not to mention, obviously, the CGTN and Xinhua.
But very lastly, Nicholas, I want to ask about big players like yourself, and there are perhaps one or two others on the continent. Do you worry about that? Do you worry about how the narrative will be changing? Yes, you may have a couple of black faces, but they're not the editors, are they? They're not the ones in the control room. So how do, especially because you are a mogul, but then you're also part of consultancy and PR, how do you stir the curve and stop a false narrative being taken out of the continent?
Listen, Juliana, I'm extremely worried. I'm a former journalist. As you may know, I stepped down as a CEO a year ago, and I use my time to start a series of conferences. I'm traveling across Africa, and I'm meeting students in journalism schools. I was in Addis Ababa University meeting students in Uganda, Makerere University, in Senegal at the CESTI, which is the largest francophone journalism school in Africa, etc., etc. So this year alone, I gave around 15 conferences to journalist students in Africa. And that's the exact topic I'm discussing with them. I'm telling them that as we speak, the African media, I mean, the African media are not in competition with the media next door. They are not in competition with the CNN and with the BBC. I was actually at the headquarters of the BBC a month ago discussing with Editor Africa there, and which was telling me that there is one country in the world with on its own represent 25% of the global audience of the BBC, and that country is Nigeria. So, in terms of threat, it is a huge threat, and I will summarize because I know we don't have a lot of time. But I will tell you this: I'm in South Africa. According to the South African government, 420 U.S. headquartered companies have an office in South Africa.
Wow.
I work with 300 of those companies.
Wow.
They are now investing across the continent with very ambitious plans. And those very ambitious expansion plans comes with big, fat advertising budget. Now, we just have to connect the dots. If in 5 years, I'm a big brand and I'm told that the best way to reach Africans or Nigerian affluent people or Ghana, etc., is CNN, and not a Nigerian TV or Ghanaian TV, where do you think I'm going to send my money?
Yes.
And that is, and if you connect those dots, you see the potential in terms of, and the threat for the African media landscape as a whole. Because without money, I mean, I always come back to the idea that the media are companies. They need money to invest, to retain the talent. And without money, the African media will lose the battle of the content, lose the battle of the talent, lose the battle of the digitalization, of the monetization. So yes, indeed, Juliana, I'm very worried.
Gosh, well, we don't want to end on a gloomy, picture, but we know the second scramble for Africa is definitely happening, and it's happening in vast industries, isn't it, including the media one. But, you know, Nicholas, you are still giving us hope. Thank you so much for joining us on Channels Business Global, and we're looking forward to having you in the studio with us when you're in London in the next couple of weeks. Thank you so much, Nicholas. That was Nicholas Pompigno-Monniard there, the founder and chairman of the APO Group. Sadly, that's all we have time for today, but do get in touch with your comments and suggestions. I'll see you at the same time next week for more in-depth business analysis on Channels Business Global. Goodbye.